Okay, welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Judd Devermont. I am the director of the Africa Program here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I am delighted to be able to present today a conversation on the future of AMISOM. We're incredibly fortunate to have Paul Williams, professor at George Washington University and author of Fighting for Peace in Somalia, and also Amanda Dory, who is the Associate Dean for Outreach at the National War College and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense at the Pentagon for Africa. This is our first conference this is my first conference as the new program director here at CSIS. It's actually quite fitting that today is the first one that we're doing on this topic. I worked this topic for a very long time. When I was in government, I was the National Security Council Director for Somalia. So I had a bit of PTSD reading Paul's piece because there was countless hours in the sit room with Amanda talking about expanding AMISOM, rehatting the Kenyans, charcoal bans, political transitions. So it's a subject that is, again, something that I connect to very strongly. And since this is really the first history of this piece, Paul, I'm really glad that I've survived your assessment. That so far you didn't throw anything at us really hard, at least. So that was a relief. But it's more important because, as we titled this is about the future of AMISOM. And one of the things that we want to do with the Africa program is to look over the horizon, to talk about how the security, political, and economic landscape is changing in Africa, and then think about what's the types of policies that we need to put together, the United States and international partners, so that we can increase prosperity and peace in sub-Saharan Africa. So I can't think of a better topic to start with, and two distinguished speakers to share their wisdom. So let me just hand it over to Paul and say thank you.
Thank you very much, Judd, and thank you everybody for coming out. It's very nice to get the invitation. Now, the book is about 145,000 words long, so it's going to take about, I think, 3.5 hours for me to explain it to you, but my remit here is in about 20 minutes, hopefully, to give you, first of all, a sort of potted summary of some of the key points of the history of the mission, which, as you know, obviously we're over the decade mark now, and then spend the second half, as Judd mentioned, talking about really how should we think about AMISOM's future. And I think the sort of short answer to that is, although clearly I can't predict the future and don't know what the future of AMISOM is going to look like, I think there are a lot of important clues and trends embedded in the history of the mission that it's going to be very difficult to change quickly, let's put it that way. The one outlier, I would say, which will sort of lead to quite divergent futures for AMISOM, would be the question of whether or not there can be a political settlement made with al-Shabaab, and that's something I'll touch on right at the end. If a settlement appears, then I think we could see quite a different set of debates and trends unfolding. If not, if it's more of the same, that's going to be my argument. We're likely to see more of the same. Now, there's just a quick reminder of where AMISOM is today at the moment, the 6 land-based sectors, at least, in south-central Somalia. AMISOM has just drawn down last year 1,000 soldiers and was supposed to add 500 police, but is still lacking 2 formed police units of about 160 police officers each. So it's about 300 short of its authorized police strength at the moment. And we've got postponed by 4 months now until the end of February 2019. AMISOM will reduce by a further 1,000 soldiers, so that you'll see the number there. We'll be at a mission of about 19,500 troops. If we get the 2 new formed police units, about 1,000 police officers and about 70 to 80 civilians. Now, the key point to remember here moving forward is just how military heavy and military dominated AMISOM is. And part of my argument overall is that there's only so much you can do in terms of achieving political and other objectives with a very blunt military instrument, and that's essentially what AMISOM is. So when I come to talk later about the debates about how we can reconfigure AMISOM going forward, it's important to remember that you can reconfigure it, but only so much given the actual composition of the force that we've got here. Now, the next thing to say by way of introduction, of course, is to sort of, I know this, most people in the room know this already, but disabuse yourself of the notion that AMISOM has anything to do with peacekeeping in the traditional sense. It doesn't, and it never has, and it probably never will, I think, well, certainly if trends continue in Somalia. Instead, what is AMISOM? My argument in the book is basically it's a sort of strange hybrid creature in that it's not really got a lot of other peace operations that share its characteristics. I think of it as being a mix, as I put up here, of sort of urban warfare on the one hand, mixed in with a bit of VIP protection on the other. And by that I mean both local Somali VIPs who have been involved in the various peace processes and the formation of the regional administrations, but also foreign VIPs. A lot of AMISOM's work, and the FPUs in particular, spend an inordinate amount of time taking foreign VIPs around and about different parts of Mogadishu and elsewhere. And then on top of that, you've got elements of counterinsurgency. But as I'll argue, in effect, AMISOM is a mission that's trying to do counterinsurgency, but is not configured in a way that's appropriate to do counterinsurgency. You've got some elements of the mandate that are about state building and trying to boost the Somali security sector in particular. And in the middle of that, we've got what we call stabilization, particularly trying to do this in the areas that have been recovered for al-Shabaab over the last couple of years. And so in terms of the strategic objectives of the mission at the moment, I want you to remember that basically these are threefold, and it's had these three strategic objectives since 2016. Obviously, the one that's probably most talked about in this town, reduce the threat from al-Shabaab and other armed opposition groups. The other armed opposition group is mainly in the form of the Islamic State at the moment, but that hasn't figured too heavily in AMISOM's operations. Secondly, and probably most fundamental, secure the political process, stabilization, reconciliation, and peace-building efforts. And here, as I'll argue, AMISOM has done a reasonable job, I think, of creating a political space in which these things could happen. But the short version is that they haven't happened, or at least they haven't happened fast, and I think in a fundamental way to transform the politics of South Central Somalia. And thirdly, more, which is where I'll focus from now on, in terms of enabling the transition of the security responsibilities to hand over to the Somali forces. And that, again, is not going particularly according to plan. Now, the potted history of sort of, there's about 80,000 words in the book that describes, and I hope documents, I think for the first time, the history of what I think is an extraordinary mission. And this is where AMISOM starts, obviously, now in Washington, D.C., Black Hawk helicopters getting shot down near Bakara Market are obviously 1993, and it brings up a whole lot of negative images and connotations there. But the story of AMISOM starts with these four little bases where 1,600 Ugandan Defence Force troops were based at the airport, at the new seaport, at Villa Somalia, the sort of presidential complex. And then the kilometre 4 road junction, which is the way you need basically, if you're driving from the airport to get to Villa Somalia, this is the key road junction to get to. Now, the reason I put this up here now is to remember just how small AMISOM was when it started. It wasn't covering South Central Somalia. It was trying to cover just the whole of one city, and it was failing to do that for at least 4 years, as I'll talk about. And as one of the Ugandan force commanders put it to me at the time, I was waffling on about something about counterinsurgency, I think. And he said, no, Prof, you idiot, basically. We're the insurgents, not al-Shabaab. We're the ones that are having to create these little footholds and trying to swim like fish amongst the local population. Al-Shabaab have got the majority of the territory here, then running most of the governing functions. Even the thing that's called a transitional federal government is not really doing governing. So the story of AMISOM starts from those very small and sort of humble beginnings with just one battle group of troops. And it spends the next 4.5 years of its mission, for want of a better term, fighting what turned out to be a very bloody urban war and battle for Mogadishu, which didn't really finish until in August 2011, the majority of al-Shabaab's forces were pushed out of central Mogadishu by AMISOM. There was then about another 6 or 7 months until AMISOM pushed forward to Afgoy and the other sort of environs areas of Mogadishu. But that was a story for these first 4.5 years of basically creeping urban operations, an admixture of, as I put up a picture here, military bulldozers and military engineering units that became absolutely crucial for AMISOM to take back a lot of the city from al-Shabaab, and also partly a story about sniper teams battling it out in that same context to sort of win the day. And my argument in the book, obviously, is with a little help from its friends, AMISOM eventually pushes al-Shabaab out. But my argument is, in essence, this was the sort of result of incremental tactical victories rather than strategic clarity or sort of a good strategy enabling this. This was done, I think, with basically blood, sweat, tears, and sacrifice, which means that in the last few years of the mission, since 2014 in particular, AMISOM has gone from those 4 little places based in one city, Mogadishu, to now a multi-dimensional and multinational mission that you see here from early 2015. AMISOM occupies a footprint of about 80 or so forward operating bases now, spread across those 6 land sectors. And this is both a symbol, obviously, of success and a source of the challenges that AMISOM faces at the same time, because as the mission went from being basically a coalition of the willing with just Uganda as the sort of big brother and Burundi as the sort of junior partner in the mission, things were a lot easier in terms of command and control and the effective deployment of military forces. As you get to this much bigger and broader spread of countries and operations across a much larger geographic territory, things get a lot more difficult fast, and that's what I'll talk about in a bit. Now, why did I write this book? I need to say a few things here just in terms of headlines. The first point is just that AMISOM, if we remind ourselves, is the longest, the biggest, the most expensive, and certainly the most deadly of all the African Union missions. By 2017, it was also the biggest peace operation in the world in terms of numbers deployed. And although it was cheap by United Nations or NATO or European Union standards, AMISOM has still cost a lot of money. It's obviously gone up a lot more as the troop numbers have increased, but from about 2014 onwards, the bill for AMISOM was totaling about $1 billion US coming from a variety of different sources. It's also been a story of, as I document in the book, a huge level of sacrifice in terms of the casualties that AMISOM has suffered, killed in action, wounded in action. AMISOM don't disclose those numbers publicly, but they are considerable, well into 4 figures of peacekeepers killed. And as a result, AMISOM, I think, since 2007, has been the key mission that's been the barometer of a lot of broader debates about contemporary peace operations, whether we're thinking about how to do partnership peacekeeping, as the UN calls it, or stabilization or counterinsurgency, or even counter-terror. And finally, because, in good academic fashion, nobody else was doing it, so I felt someone should. What does it do? The book, in sort of 140,000 words down to 2 slides, it basically tells in the first part a history of the operation. And as Judd's already mentioned there, I basically talk through the different phases, as I understand them, of the mission. These are my arbitrary classifications. The mission itself has different ways of thinking about phases, but doesn't use this vocabulary, obviously. It's a mission, as I said, that goes from a sort of small foothold in one city to a much more sprawling operation across south-central Somalia. And for those of you that, like me, your geography is not your best subject, south-central Somalia is about the same size as Iraq. And if you think about operating in Iraq with about 20,000 troops, you'll start to get a sense of exactly how overstretched AMISOM was in terms of the numbers. The second part then analyzes what I consider to be the 6 major operational challenges that AMISOM faced. It's all right. I've heard worse. I got interrupted by a phone went off with a Darth Vader breathing thing going off. Well, at least I think it was a Darth Vader breathing thing. The major operational challenges, as I see them, was 6-fold, and that was, how did AMISOM deal with logistics when actually these, for most of the mission, have been provided by either external bilateral partners or the United Nations? Security sector reform runs through the story of how AMISOM has had to partner with the transitional federal government security forces and then the Somali National Army. And that is a story, basically, if these are your friends, you don't really need enemies at some level. Civilian protection is important because in AMISOM's case, unlike pretty much every other contemporary mission, AMISOM has no mandate to proactively protect civilians. But that doesn't stop Somali civilians expecting to be protected by AMISOM, regardless of the mandate. So there's a whole lot of challenges that have incurred along that dimension. Strategic communications is basically the story of the information war that has taken place between al-Shabaab and the African Union and the UN. And sadly, my sort of short version of this is that for much of this time, al-Shabaab has been winning the sort of Stratcom information battle here. Stabilization and exit, obviously then, once AMISOM pushes al-Shabaab out of a lot of the major population centers, how does it actually deliver a real peace dividend to the local populations there? And again, this is a story that's largely framed in the negative. AMISOM really struggled to clear, hold, and build in any of the senses of those terms. And finally, the chapter finishes off with a look at AMISOM's exit strategies. AMISOM has had an exit strategy since day one, back in March 2007, which was about handing over to a UN peacekeeping mission, but obviously that has not transpired. And so we're now about how we can hand over to Somali forces. Has it made a positive impact overall? My argument is basically yes, but with a bunch of caveats. And what I put up here is just a, thank courtesy to Google Earth sort of thing, a satellite image of the city from February 2007, and then a satellite image from May 2017. And trust me when I say it's considerable. So the starting point for all of my analysis about has AMISOM had a positive impact is that if for no other reason than being the security blanket that has allowed a massive or relatively massive international presence, they wouldn't be there without the sacrifices that the African Union mission has made. Having said that, though, there's a lot of caveats and problems with AMISOM. It's really struggled in terms of having unified command and control. In fact, since it expanded out from Mogadishu, it's never had unified command and control. As one of the deputy force commanders put it to me, we have command of these forces but no control over them, so the best we can hope for is coordination. And that, I think, has been the story of the Force HQ from 2012 onwards. Second big problem, it's displaced pretty effectively al-Shabaab from a lot of the major population centers, but displacing al-Shabaab's key combat capabilities is not the same thing as destroying them. And there's been a lot of cat and mouse going on for a long time. The short version is, in my estimation, AMISOM is basically slower than al-Shabaab's forces most of the time in most of the places. And since April 2012, al-Shabaab has not wanted to fight AMISOM in a sort of conventional sense on its own terms, at least. It's also had problems of camouflaging, particularly if you talk to Somali populations here, AMISOM being a sort of camouflage for various partisan agendas from the neighbors. Kenya, obviously, you already mentioned, the charcoal trade and the corruption around Kismayo. And Ethiopia with various political agendas about who's getting appointed governor of which regional administration, and obviously bringing the TFG to Mogadishu in the first place. AMISOM also has had a pretty bad track record of causing civilian harm. This was very bad in the first few years, but got better as it changed its indiscriminate fire policies. But there's still a lot of problems when fundamentally a lot of AMISOM soldiers in the rank and file do not know the difference between an al-Shabaab operative and a Somali civilian. And both of those can be carrying weapons at any given time, and you can see how the problems escalate rapidly. AMISOM's also failed to generate a lot of key capabilities, and it's also failed largely to secure a lot of the main supply routes. Corruption and misconduct I've already mentioned, but just to give you a visual image, this is from Amin Arts. This is, in my opinion at least, the sort of most widely looked at political cartoonist in Somalia. And you can see here there's a lot of derogatory opinions about AMISOM, whether you're talking about strategically dealing with al-Shabaab, civilian harm issues, are they in it just for the money, sexual exploitation and abuse, the like, you get the picture. These types of ideas and these types of opinions have certainly not gone away, but I do think they've dissipated somewhat, and I'm happy to come back to those later. In positive terms, though, we've got to remember it has achieved, I think, quite a lot. 2 transitional federal governments, 2 official federal governments, 2 selection processes have been run pretty effectively under an AMISOM security blanket. It has pushed al-Shabaab fighters out of Mogadishu and the major population centers in south central Somalia. And in that sense did provide, I think, the political space for Somali elites to actually engage in peace building and reconciliation. It is not AMISOM's fault that they haven't done that. And I think that's the biggest political challenge moving forward. Also on AMISOM's watch, the process of establishing the regional administrations has gone from basically 0 to 5 or so over the period up to 2016. And as I mentioned before, the whole range of international actors that now operate out of Mogadishu International Airport and a few more in Baidoa and a few less in Kismayo and elsewhere, they wouldn't be there without that blanket provided by AMISOM. And finally, in terms of humanitarian relief, a lot of medical procedures, food, water supplies and other things have been supplied by the mission to locals. Now, to finish on the future of AMISOM, I think that's going to revolve around the 4 factors that I put up here. How do we reconfigure the mission, number 1? How does it work more effectively with its partners, number 2? Who's going to pay the bills, and how are they going to get paid and when? And then finally, what is al-Shabaab up to? And that's where I want to sort of finish my remarks. The first one, reconfiguring AMISOM. As I said earlier, yeah, we've got to reconfigure AMISOM again, but there's a whole lot of capability gaps that come with this mission. Oh, first technical hitch of the day. That is meant to show a lot of little national flags as to when the different troop contributing countries appeared in the mission. I'm glad the helicopters have turned up at least, that's important. So the point here is just that, as I mentioned before, AMISOM has started off just as a Ugandan battle group, and then Burundi, Djibouti, Kenya, Sierra Leone and Ethiopia joined. But the point of the chart is to show you just how difficult it's been to generate the personnel. It took 3.5 years for AMISOM to get its initial authorized strength of 8,000 soldiers on the ground. 3.5 years. So the vast majority of, obviously, the African Union states voted with their feet and just didn't turn up. But also specialized units, key enablers and key capabilities, engineers, medical support, etc. Helicopters, I think, are the sort of most widely debated example of that. You'll see there the crash. In August 2012, 3 Ugandan helicopters en route to the mission crashed on the slopes of Mount Kenya, which wasn't obviously ideal for anyone concerned. But it wasn't until then, December 2016, that the Kenyans put in 3 military helicopters into the mission. And if we just pause and think for a moment, what does it mean to be functioning as an operation this large with basically no military aviation? You know, we wouldn't even contemplate deploying a NATO or EU force without any aviation support, but AMISOM did it for the best part of 10 years. The only helicopters that they had were some military utility ones that were provided by the UN that mainly focused on casualty evacuation and the logistics support. The other bit here is that as AMISOM has spread out, it's become more vulnerable. And my assessment at the moment would be that AMISOM's forces are basically overstretched. They're dotted around, as I said, in about 80 different forward operating bases. Many of those have got just a company or so of soldiers in them and are hence quite vulnerable. The main supply routes between them are still under pretty constant IED attack, ambush, and other forms of harassment by al-Shabaab. And the map I put up there is the 5 major attacks on forward operating bases that al-Shabaab has conducted since 2015. It only went well in Halgan, the Ethiopian base in June 2016, where AMISOM effectively repelled that attack, but the others did not. Secondly, in terms of AMISOM's partnerships, this is as complicated as it gets. There are about, depending how you count them, about 200 different peace operations around the world since about the late 1940s, early 1950s. And I've studied all of them a little bit at least. AMISOM is by far the most complicated mission we've ever seen in terms of what it takes to get it actually running on the ground. This is the simple version, at least as simple as I can make it. But partnerships are crucial, and trying to get the European Union on board, the UN on board, the US, the UK, the French, the Italians, other bilateral donors that don't do train and equip. Oh, and then, by the way, in your area of operations, there are going to be a whole lot of parallel things going on. The Ethiopians will do strikes and missions outside of your command and control. So will the Kenyans, so will the Americans, and so will the Somali Army. You can see how the partnerships become crucial but difficult. And they've basically fractured on and off over time. Penultimately, then, the money. I think, sadly, AMISOM's future should be dictated by political and strategic considerations, but I think it's more likely to be dictated by financial considerations, and I think that's not healthy for anyone concerned. What I've put up here is just showing you that a reminder that AMISOM was a mission done on the cheap, if you compare it to UN deployments. And so the rate of personnel allowances and reimbursements that the UN gets are the yellow and blue lines. They basically the effective rate of reimbursement from the UN, and then the actual rate if you add in some personal equipment items and some other bits and bobs. You'll see there that before January of 2010, AMISOM was getting paid a lot less, $500 a month and then $750 a month, and a deal was struck to align AMISOM's reimbursement rates with that of the United Nations peacekeeping. That fell apart subsequently for two reasons. The first reason was the UN rate kept going up subsequently and AMISOM's rate didn't. And then from January 2016, the second reason was that the European Union decided to cut 20% off the allowances payments. So today, an AMISOM peacekeeper is paid, or I should say their government of the TCCs is paid about $800. A UN peacekeeper in Cyprus or on the Golan Heights or wherever is paid about $1,400. And you can imagine what this does for morale and general, morale sums it up. And finally, AMISOM's enemy, al-Shabaab. This is a sophisticated and adaptable, a resilient and a deadly opponent. And it's proved that time and time again. It's learnt the lesson that if you fight AMISOM front on, generally in conventional style, you're going to lose most of the time. So al-Shabaab has been waging a pretty effective war of destabilization, harassment. That doesn't need a lot of people to carry out its missions. It doesn't need a lot of money to fund its missions. With commando and suicide raids and a few complex attacks, this can be done pretty cheaply and can be pretty effective. It's also been supported by, as I mentioned earlier, a pretty sophisticated strategic communications campaign, which has, I think, done a lot of the time a much better job than AMISOM here. And so the story at the moment, I think, is really AMISOM, in my estimation, has sort of culminated militarily. AMISOM is doing roughly what AMISOM can do militarily. That is, push the majority of al-Shabaab's conventional forces out of the major population centers across south-central Somalia. But it can't do much more than that, unless it's willing to take a lot of political risks and invest a lot of political will and ultimately take casualties to go after these forces in a more serious manner. And it hasn't done that for really the last 2.5 years. So to my mind, then, the only outlier, and this is where I'll stop, is that we can either, I think, if we look to the future, see pretty much more of the same. I don't think AMISOM has the capabilities or the political will to really take on a more offensive or successfully offensive set of operations against al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab, I think, has actually had a pretty good couple of years lately. It's been doing this stuff pretty effectively for pretty cheap. It's been running a pretty, I think, sophisticated and effective campaign of sort of governance and justice and taxation mechanisms across fair swathes of south-central Somalia, which means it's sort of survived the stalemate, I think, in many ways better than AMISOM over the last 2 years. The one outlier, which in my last trip to Somalia in August, which I was noticeably sort of much more widely and openly debated, was the issue of whether there should be talks started with al-Shabaab to come to a political settlement of the conflict. Now, if that happens, the dynamics can really shift. But one word of caution, even if there's a political settlement, AMISOM is not going away quickly anytime soon. AMISOM, I think, is in Somalia, for better or worse, for at least another decade. It should probably and will probably reconfigure in terms of it's not going to look like a 20,000 plus strong military operation for another decade. But if you think of it in normal peace operations terms, AMISOM is not even at year 0 yet for peacekeeping or peace operations. And by year 0, I mean most UN missions would only deploy to a country once you've had a ceasefire or a peace deal. And then they take about a decade to help implement the peace deal once you've got it, right? That's a pretty tough ask anyway. In Somalia, we've just been in war zone territory here. There's no peace deal, no political settlement. So even if we got one, we shouldn't expect that AMISOM can just exit immediately. So that's my potted history. Sorry, I went a bit over time.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Paul. Amanda?
Well, thank you. It's nice to look out in the group here and see lots of familiar faces, to include colleagues from DOD and State Department and AID. And it's a pleasure to be here, Judd, at your invitation and wearing an academic hat while I'm sitting over at National War College and kind of bring to this a hybrid academic and practitioner perspective. I invited Judd the other day to come speak to a group of students who are focused on African studies and to do a lay down at a continental scale of security trends. And I tried to get in, pretty soon after he came here to CSIS and said, I hope I'll be your first request to come and speak. And he did. He did a great job. And he said, there's a quid pro quo for that. But I didn't realize it was your first event here as well. So it's great to be here. And coupled with Paul and all of the work that he has done for years and years now, following AMISOM and its evolution. I think he's really set the table well for what I'll try to do, which includes a little bit of context from another perspective, kind of less historical, but some of the key factors currently. A little bit on orchestration, then options, and then trade-offs. So that's the structure of what I'll try to put out there. I think it's a great time to be having this discussion. The mission is authorized through May of 2019 at the moment, so there's a little bit of breathing space. One of the things that I have noticed over time is that there's constantly a review underway by someone in that constellation of participants that Paul laid out already. So there's always a review, there's always a mandate that needs to be reviewed. Paul mentioned the VIP protection. There's a lot of just mechanics that happen that at times distract from getting the mission done. But I do think the timing is excellent to be having this conversation about the way ahead for AMISOM. In terms of some contextual factors about AMISOM, as Paul mentioned, mission underway for a little over a decade now, a very unique configuration with respect to an AU-led mission, but sustained and supported by a UN logistics package and political mission. So it is charting new ground in its decade-long existence. Paul laid out the slide to show the many different stakeholders. I had a slightly different way of expressing that idea. I think of it as a series of coalitions of the willing. And when you're working on strategy and good strategy, you try to think about your ends, your ways, and your means, and having some sort of alignment and coherence among those. But in these different coalitions of the willing, you have different actors with different ends. The ends, ways, and means are not controlled in any kind of unitary or coherent way. So you have some of your means are provided by the troop contributing countries in terms of boots on the ground. So you've got one coalition of the willing that's providing that set of capabilities. You have a different coalition of the willing that's providing the financial resources to sustain the mission. And you have different set of partners on the ground in Somalia who are the primary political actors in terms of political objectives from a national perspective. And the combination of these different coalitions of the willing leads to tremendous complexity, inefficiency, dysfunction, blame shifting, finger pointing, and massive coordination problems at all times. So that is just baked into this arrangement. Paul did one of the things also that I've noticed when you're talking about Somalia, kind of your glass half full, glass half empty perspective depends in part on what lens you're using, what time frame you're using. And I was noticing the other day someone was remarking on the 49-year anniversary of the coup by then General Siad Barre, which led to a period of military rule, eventually led to breakdown of civil order, a stateless Somalia, if you looked 25 years or so ago, and the gradual progress that we have seen as Paul has laid out so well. So if you're looking with a 25-year lens or a 10-year lens or even a 5-year lens, now having a recognized Somali government again for a 5-year period, that's all slow progress in terms of a state formation process. If you look just with the last year or two or since the last mandate update, then it's harder at times to see that progress, but it helps to have the long lenses. Paul mentioned the current AMISOM mandate. By my count, that's the 6th mandate. I don't know if you would agree with that, but that tells you something as well, 6 mandates in a decade-long period, so constant fine-tuning and adjustments. And the current approach, the current transition plan is one that's being described as a conditions-based transition plan on the one hand, but also has a deadline associated with it in terms of the end of 2021. So that's an interesting hybrid arrangement when you think about it. It's conditions based on the one hand, but it has a notional deadline associated with it. Shifting now to thinking about orchestration, how you could get to having a transition. To my way of thinking, there are three different tracks that all intersect together. When I was at the Pentagon, we tried to solve for the idea of growing Somali security forces being, kind of one path, drawing down AMISOM security forces, and we would have this discussion: when is the crossover point, and how would you get there? And we were never able to solve that equation in any kind of meaningful way. And in part because you have the third track, which is a political track, which intersects with the track of the ability to generate Somali security forces. And that track is out of the hands and out of the planning timelines of the U.S. government or anyone else in terms of the trajectory that it's on. So just a little bit on the different tracks. So the first track I consider to be the political track. President Formaggio is making some important steps of progress. We heard from the National Security Advisor, Abdi Said, when he was here the week before last. As is typically the case, you see 2 steps forward and 1 step back at any given time. I would say some of the things in the 2 steps forward category include that there's now an agreed national security architecture in place. The president initiated an operational readiness assessment to take a good hard look at the security forces available to him, Somali security forces. The Somali government is establishing ownership and speaking of the need to be Somali-led at this point, which is important as well. The steps backward, you could consider the breakdown in relations currently between the federal government and the member states as a pretty significant step backward. The National Security Council is not currently functioning, and the ability to make progress on some of the other pending items like completion of the Constitution and revenue sharing arrangements between the center and the member states is at risk. As well as planning for elections in the 2020-2021 timeframe and how those will be conducted, and how they move forward beyond the famous 4.5 formula, clan formula, and moving in the direction of something that's closer to one person, one vote. Paul, you had selection up on your slide instead of an election. Just one final thought in terms of the importance of the political track. I was looking back at the study that Seth Jones did when he was still at RAND before he came to CSIS, when he did the exhaustive study, 600 some case studies looking at how terrorism ends, and it was done about a decade ago to inform thinking about how does al-Qaeda end. And in his case study look, he found that a little over 40% of the time, terrorist groups end because of a political solution. So I think that tracks, again, with what Paul mentioned earlier and what I'll highlight in terms of a potential option. The second track to mention is the one that we looked at very closely, which was how quickly can you generate capable Somali security forces. And I think in that regard, having an agreed national security architecture and the numbers associated with that is important. Having the operational readiness assessment where it is clear to the Somali leadership and to others where the deficiencies are, and they are many on the one hand. But also there's some signs of progress, and I think we heard a little bit about this during the visit of the National Security Advisor. Some of the reforms underway in terms of the procurement space and removal of officials who are corrupt. The beginning of use of biometrics in terms of weapons accountability and pay systems. This could increase the confidence in terms of bilateral and other supporters of Somali's security services going forward, if there's a sense that the investments are being applied in the ways intended by those supporters. One of the things that we have seen is that previous efforts to mass produce Somali security services have really not panned out, and you can see some of the numbers out there in terms of the thousands and thousands of Somali security services who have been trained but can't be located, or equipment that's been dispersed but also can't be located. So just the ephemeral nature of some of the training initiatives that have happened up to that point. So I think kind of realistic timeline in terms of how quickly they can be generated is probably in a decade period of time as well, matching Paul's prediction in terms of AMISOM's tenure. And also the need to sync better together the tactical level proficiency with institutional underpinnings or overpinnings, if you will, so that the two are aligned. And that can't be surged. It just takes time for that to happen. The third track is really the security environment itself, what's happening with al-Shabaab, what's happening with Islamic State. Their ability to control terrain is still substantial, as has already been mentioned. AMISOM has not been on an offensive in a significant way in a period of time, and so the ability of AMISOM to effectively change the security environment is in question, notwithstanding the support of the United States and others to AMISOM. AMISOM does have transitional goals, though, the ones that have been discussed, the return of the stadium in Mogadishu to the federal government, goals with respect to the road between Mogadishu and Baidoa, and retaking of Ligo. Those are all important goals and should be supported going forward in terms of transition. Options, pathways for an eventual transition. One of the biggest challenges is just keeping the pressure on all parties to move forward on the one hand, but then recognizing the need for some element of flexibility. So I see four general options. The first one I'm calling the new status quo, which is this idea that is in association with the current mandate, which is the focus on transition from AMISOM to Somali sovereign forces. And in this one, you focus on meeting the deadline of the end of 2021 on the one hand, but then you recognize that some adjustments will probably be necessary because whether you're planning for elections or anything else, there's always slippage. Things take longer than you think they'll need to take. So that's kind of a status quo option out there. A second option is one that I call a surge option, which is really you hold the deadline of the end of 2021 and you focus on what is it that you can do to really put pressure on making progress with respect to the political track and possibly with respect to an AMISOM surge of some sort, so that you've got pressure on Shabaab in terms of military pressure on Shabaab, but also the focus on the political track and the potential for some form of reconciliation with reconcilable elements of Shabaab. A third option I call buck passing, which is said with thanks to the realist school of IR theory and Dr. Mearsheimer in particular. We were just going through this at War College, so it was fresh on my mind. But you look for what are other resourcing options, and I think this tracks with Paul's focus on kind of where are the resources coming from for transition going forward. So a couple of variants on this. One is the initial idea that AMISOM was going to transition to UN peacekeeping operation. We have seen this with other AU missions in Mali, for example, or Central African Republic, where that transition did happen. You can think of a couple of different ways this could happen, to include if there is some kind of political agreement in place, there is a peace to keep in some parts, maybe not all of Somalia, but in Mogadishu and beyond, where maybe a UN peacekeeping operation would be more of a possibility than it is currently. A different version of buck passing would be to look at a more sustainable funding profile. There have been discussions at various points about a cost-sharing agreement between the United Nations and African Union that would enable African Union to tap into some of the assessed contributions to the UN. Those conversations have died off in the last year and a half or so, but it's possible that those could be regenerated again to look at what a arrangement might look like. Another kind of bug passing option is looking for new donors into the UN Peace Fund or the AMISOM Trust Fund. There isn't a long list out there, but I would note that China, with Belt and Road, has several of the TCCs as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as Somalia joining in the future. And all of these countries are engaged with China at some level. China has also made commitments in terms of increased pledges for increased funding when it comes to peacekeeping operations, as well as police training and having 2 formed police units that are ostensibly ready for UN missions. So there may be some other potential stakeholders who might be willing to step up more than they have up to this point. And then the final option that I see is one that I just called conclude, which is that you accept that AMISOM finishes by the end of 2021. You make as much progress as possible over the next 3 years. When AMISOM concludes, you recognize that there will be a reconfiguration on the ground, that neighbors will still have their security interests and will posture themselves accordingly, that different business interests, trade and investment interests will still exist, will still provide security to some extent for their own investments, and that some of the distorting elements that come with having a peacekeeping mission and its associated resources will no longer be distorting, and that you'll have a new status quo that is established at that time. I'm not saying that this is a good option, but it is an option. So finally, just a little bit of a discussion about trade-offs and opportunity costs that, Judd, you asked me to do, thinking about how U.S. support to AMISOM compares relative to other interests that we have. Paul mentioned U.S. and EU both as substantial supporters over time. The figures are a little difficult to add up, but the EU, I have seen figures at about $1.6 billion up to this point in terms of their support, stipends and otherwise to AMISOM. U.S. is more than $1 billion. I couldn't get more fidelity in a quick period of time, but when you look at the different support to TCCs on a bilateral basis, as well as U.S. assessed contributions, were beyond the $1 billion mark. So obviously a significant investment on the part of both EU and U.S., and both of these entities have competing interests, and including significantly in the United States, the shift with the national security strategy in the direction of great power competition, with less of a focus on the problems of extremism and terrorism. And then with the European Union, the focus on migration concerns and Brexit, and really more of a shift towards the Sahel and channels of migration through the Maghreb. So another way of thinking about the trade-offs that we've experienced over time, this has come up a lot in terms of United States security interests relative to interests when it comes to governance or prosperity or our values. And a lot of discussion on whether our security interests have displaced some of the concerns we might have in terms of various troop contributing countries when it comes to things like freedom of speech and assembly, the changing of constitutions to enable incumbents to stay in power, crackdowns on opposition. So I looked up the Freedom House 2018 rankings and compared it to the troop contributing countries. And Burundi, Djibouti, and Ethiopia at the time were all qualified as not free, and Kenya and Uganda as partially free. So I think you can certainly see some trade-offs that have been made over time when it comes to the different interests of the United States government. There are also regional trade-offs with respect to resources invested in Horn of Africa relative to the Sahel, Lake Chad Basin, other areas with significant challenges, not to mention those that don't have extremism to contend with, but are unstable and facing challenges like the DRC, South Sudan, and Central African Republic. And last but not least, there's certainly been trade trade-off with respect to United States focus on security issues and stability in Africa rather than prosperity-related issues in terms of trade and investment. So we don't have a United States Belt and Road Initiative, for example. We do have lots of important initiatives, things like Power Africa, Feed the Future, that are out there and are significant contributions in this space, but really not the investment with returns that are coming back to the United States in a significant way. So I think I'll stop there for now. There's a lot to discuss. We could also talk about the kind of recent developments in Ethiopia and the positive externalities in the region, also the negative externalities coming from kind of Gulf countries and their feuds and how those are playing out in the Horn of Africa.
Great. Well, thank you, Amanda. Thanks, Paul. A lot on the table. Amanda just threw, we just have separate conferences for those topics. But I'll take speaker's prerogative and I'll ask one question, then we'll open it up. When I worked this issue in 2011, 2012, I think we had this convergence of actors who saw the problem the same way or recognized the urgency of the problem. So whether it was Ethiopia and Kenya or it was us, the United States, and our European partners, and I think we made a tremendous amount of gains during that period. As you said, Amanda, this coalition of the willing. But it certainly seems that coalition is evolving and arguably it's breaking down. I just think that there's much more of a delta between the various actors on the ways, ends, and means approach than perhaps we had 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and we can tick them off. The Europeans cutting budget support, some of the TCCs who got in there for training or got in there for international reputation, maybe being less of a reason why, an incentive to stay, although others having security imperatives that are going to keep them on the ground. So I wanted to ask Paul and Amanda if you had thoughts too on, how do we reconcile these very increasingly divergent views by stakeholders about this mission? Do they even recognize, as Paul says, which I agree, that we've reached the military culmination of AMISOM? And how does that position them for any of the 4 options, Amanda, that you brought up?
I don't have an answer to that. The way I would answer it, though, the thing of addressing is, if you think of the AMISOM mission itself as a mini coalition of the willing, the good news is they've never all been coherent and wanting to do the same thing and in there for the same reason. So in that sense, we don't face a major difference than we've always faced, I think. But the way I think of it is you've got, in essence, 2 types of contributor. You've got the Ethiopians and the Kenyans on the one hand, who are in there regardless of AMISOM's existence or not, right? They face key, I would say, national security issues with what's going on across their border. And as a result, they've tended to conceptualize their activities in AMISOM as part of a bigger project of sort of buffer zone politics or sort of borderland security and defense, right, to put it in those terms. And then you've got a second camp of contributors, Sierra Leone obviously gone now, but Djibouti, Burundi, Uganda, who haven't got core national security issues at play, but are in there because they've either been politically nudged by donors and partners and others to get them in there. And that's where, the training equip, the political economy of AMISOM's contributions has been really important to them. I would say for Djibouti and Burundi in particular, that was the key motivating factor. With Burundi, it gets a bit more complicated because you've got the attempt to sort of build a coherent national army after the civil war in that country between the old rebels and the professional military, and what better bonding experience than to go to Mogadishu and fight al-Shabaab together. But Burundi, I think now, with the current crisis since 2015, with President Nkurunziza going into the 3rd term issue, there we've seen his soldiers in Somalia as a source of basically foreign exchange generation, I think is a primary consideration. Which leaves Uganda, for me, has always been the sort of the skeleton and the backbone and the spine of AMISOM. Now, Uganda, I think, obviously, no Ugandan foreign policy decision happens outside of Museveni's decision-making corridors, let's say, right? And in that sense, it's a story in part about what's his calculation of whether the UPDF is, I think, helpful or not in Somalia, and then outside of Somalia, is it helpful to his broader regional project and his ideas about being the big man in that part of the world and the region? And I think there, legitimately, the Ugandans have sacrificed more than most when it comes to AMISOM. I don't get the sense that they would want to just pull out in a sort of irresponsible manner, given how much effort they put into it before. So I think there is a real political calculation there as to in terms of, are they providing an unhelpful crutch, which is actually preventing Somali elites and the Somali National Army to stand up on their own? Or are they a helpful part of supporting the building up and the development of the SNA? I mean, I think that's a genuine dilemma that the Ugandans face. And then, as I mentioned in my talk, I think all of the TCCs face the issue of, are you willing just to tread water at the moment, or are you really willing to put the political will and hence the casualties that will follow if you really went on some serious offensive now? Most of the mission is basically hunkered down in its forward operating bases. They are not, or when they use the main supply routes, they're under regular attack from IEDs and ambushes, and they're taking casualties that way. So this is a sort of a treading water status quo, but it's even quite a bloody and casualty-riven status quo. I don't get the sense there's any real political will to take this on again. And the last example we have is Operation Safari Hunter, which was down in Sector 2 in Kismayo, where the Kenyans, the Somali National Army, the Jubaland Security Forces, a few other aligned militias, and a bit of United States support via Danab and other things, tried to get basically their way towards Jilib, which is one of the major al-Shabaab concentrations of power at the moment. And we saw the same old story play out again, that a bit of progress was made initially, and then it ground to a halt, and things fell apart. So I think that coalition of countries are going to diverge in those ways that I've indicated. I think Ethiopia and Kenya are here to stay, regardless of AMISOM, but we'll have to think about what configuration they do. And I think the rest ultimately hinges on Uganda and its decision there.
The only other thing I would add to what Paul just said is the difference perhaps in parts of the coalition of the willing who consider sunk costs, even though economically you're theoretically not supposed to, but many parts of the coalition have many sunk costs, whether they're the casualty costs, whether it's amount of resources invested over time towards a particular outcome, and are willing to use the longer lenses relative to the shorter lenses. So that's one animating factor for parts of the coalition. The other is those who are focused on results in the future, and that lies in the hands, in part, of the president and other Somali leaders. Are they demonstrating good enough progress to keep the coalition together?
Great. Why don't we open it up for questions? Leslie, and then we'll go here. Kat's going to come around with the mic. Although it's a fairly small room.
Hi, Leslie Warner, House Foreign Affairs Committee. Looking forward to reading your book. So I think I'm curious about what you think about the chances for concentrated regional and international pressure to enhance the likelihood that the Somali government will advance along lines of political reconciliation, as opposed to the pressure that the international community has exerted in terms of quote unquote planning the war instead of planning the peace. And the reason I'm asking that question is, one could argue that in the aftermath of the 2010 World Cup bombings, there was a concentrated regional push to try and get the transitional government towards the quote unquote, as you put, selected government, or at least the first permanent government in decades, in 2012, I believe it was. And so do you foresee any sort of regional or international push to force that sort of, to force any sort of initiative to advance along their political reforms that the Somali government needs to make in order to ensure that the gains that AMISOM is making on the security front are more sustainable?
I hope that's what they've been trying to do for the last 8 years at least, right? But it's been a dismal failure on that point. So the way I will conceptualize what's happening, at least from AMISOM's perspective, is AMISOM has made various military gains on the military track, but it's never been sort of in sync with the political gains on the political track. And this is the conundrum that every peace operation faces, in that AMISOM can't dictate local political solutions in Somalia. That can only come about with, in this case now, the federal government agreeing with the regional administrations, having a degree of peace building and reconciliation occur, and then you can move forward with the national security architecture and all the plans. So I would like to have been a fly on the wall sort of thing in these meetings where this pressure has been exerted. But clearly, I think the evidence of the last 10 years is that whatever the international coalition of actors that have been trying to create these incentives for the Somali government and the regional elites to do precisely that has failed, right? And we've not seen basically, in that sense, much leverage from the outside. What it has generated, you're right, is a whole lot of efforts, about a dozen different countries involved in the sort of tactical and operational attempts to build up the Somali army in particular, which is a legitimate dilemma when you're trying to do these things and fight a war against al-Shabaab at the same time. But the elites, I think, in Somalia, and I mean federal and regional now, I think have showed exactly the opposite tendencies. Instead of using, as Amanda said, money and equipment and training that's come in, a lot of it has been squandered, a lot of it has been snaffled away. As the ORA from 2017 showed, the SNA is in no fit state to do anything beyond sort of defend most of its locale. So I think the case for business as usual is a dismal failure, in my opinion. And the debate going forward has to be, how do you generate precisely those sources of leverage? Now, that may mean competing, as you said, with Gulf state actors and the actors that are trying to sort of split the regions and the federal government on the one hand. You need, I guess, an alternative coalition to pull them together again. But I haven't seen a good example either coming out of the London conference or anything subsequently about how you really generate reconciliation between these political elites in Somalia, because that's the key to it all. Without some degree of national reconciliation, you can't just train and equip a national army into existence. At best, you can get what we've got, I suppose, little fiefdoms and little either clan-related or sort of militia-related military units, but it's not going to add up to more than the sum of its parts. So I don't know the answer, but somebody needs to figure that out. Just finally on that, Mr. Guaheno and Ramtain Lamamra, who were the champions on the financial package issue, their way of answering that question was basically to say you're more likely to get financial and resource buy-in if the political story and the political strategy you can tell about the future is sensible, coherent, and gets buy-in. But we haven't seen that yet, and that's what I think is the sort of $64 million question. Who can generate the actual leverage to get Somali elites to change their calculus on this?
Leslie, what you're talking about is what I had in mind with the surge option 2 idea, kind of putting the pressure on for political progress, in part driven by having a deadline and the end of kind of programmed resources for the mission to hold their feet to the fire. But kind of different. The UK through its conferences has helped create pressure in the past. They're a bit busy right now, so that's problematic. They could come back to it. The AU could take that role. The United States, in theory, could take that role. We don't seem like we're well postured to do that right now, but you could see, kind of either individual actors or several banding together could create that type of pressure for political results.
I just want to add, I think, Leslie, the event that is really interesting in this conversation happened in Kampala, but it wasn't in 2010, it was in 2011. And the region was really frustrated when they did the Kampala Accords and extended Sheikh Sharif. And I think we saw a ramping up of pressure from the region through 2012 to the transition to make things happen. And what I loved about Amanda's options is they all did end at 2021. So I think, first of all, we have to actually believe that that's a deadline and we're serious about it. We also have to revise, I think, some of the benchmarks. I personally think that one man, one vote may be too far afield, and we continue to talk about it as that's what's definitely should happen before the next election, just as we did for the previous election. So I think we need to moderate our benchmarks so we can think about an incremental move towards a more democratic system. And then we have to actually be all in on this, and we're not, right? Like, I don't think that Somalia is getting the kind of attention on the political reconciliation that it did in that 2011, 2012, 2013 period. And I think we can tie this back to the Europeans, who I think do want to get out of funding this program and this effort. They would like to be spending most of their time, as Paul said, on the Sahel. I think there are different ways to bring in partners, but we have to be quite honest about what each of those different partners, those coalitions and willings, want, and then actually focus on this. And we tend to flint in on this issue towards the end of a political process, the very end of that cycle, and we've missed the opportunity to, I think, march from the very beginning with partners to make sure that the Somalis know that 2021 is a true deadline and that we are going to marshal our resources, diplomatic and otherwise, to get there. But without that, we will just keep rolling on the way that we are. Sir?
Thank you. I'm just a student, but from what I could understand, it's like from the beginning, the mission was not focused on destroying al-Shabaab. It was just about pushing them out from the cities, and they would go somewhere where they feel safe, I guess. But my question is why they didn't go exactly after them to destroy them and kill them and get rid of them entirely? Because now with the shaky situation we have over there in the political situation, and my question is, I think they're going to come back whenever it's possible. So what's the plan to face them when they come back?
Thank you. So the way I would answer that is there's no way AMISOM can militarily defeat al-Shabaab, I don't think. That's partly because of the nature of al-Shabaab as a movement and partly because of the nature and characteristics of AMISOM as a mission. But the military instrument is blunt. And when you're dealing with a group of sometimes insurgents, sometimes more like local population, right? When you're dealing with a movement like al-Shabaab, who have got relatively strong freedom of movement, they've got a strong ability to infiltrate both local populations and the government in Somalia and its security forces. When sympathizers for al-Shabaab and even sometimes open al-Shabaab members are members of parliament and members of the political elite in different parts of the country, there's a very blurry dividing line, between where al-Shabaab stops and Somali broader society starts. So the nature of your enemy, I would say, is murky, first of all. Secondly, in a more operational sense, as I mentioned before, AMISOM did fight al-Shabaab, a long, bloody battle for Mogadishu when the two sides both wanted to fight over the same strategic territory, i.e. bits of Mogadishu, particularly Bakara Market. After 2011 and 2012, though, al-Shabaab has generally taken the decision that it doesn't want to fight AMISOM conventionally, and it will generally give up most areas of territory that it doesn't consider to be crucial for either keeping various populations coerced or for generating taxation and commercial revenue. And there's a few other places that we have seen combat, but they're relatively few and far between. And there, as I mentioned before, AMISOM was just not a force that was configured to destroy that type of enemy's combat capabilities, for the main reason that al-Shabaab were basically quicker and more mobile than AMISOM forces. Remember, AMISOM was operating without air support for the vast majority of its time on the ground. So it had no real way to sort of strike from depth. More recently, you see I put up a picture on the slide, AMISOM's been given a new sort of ISR unit and drone capabilities, but this is just monitoring. Again, it may be able to see more of al-Shabaab's movements, but it can't necessarily strike them quickly. And the vast majority, finally, of AMISOM's forces, they're not geared up as some sort of rapid reaction force that can be deployed quickly either by helicopters or some other means. It's a mission that is strung out, and I would say overstretched, across about 80 different bases. And it's al-Shabaab, actually, that is in the strongest position there, because a company of soldiers, as we've seen, out in an forward operating base, who don't mount regular patrols out to the local population, there's not really a lot of local engagement there. They have actually become vulnerable a number of times to al-Shabaab mass attacks. So I think that's the military story in a nutshell, which means for me, if you want to reduce the threat of al-Shabaab, you've got to think about political and economic incentives instead. You've got to think about, for example, how could we buy out support of al-Shabaab soldiers and its sort of leaders. And you have over the years seen a number of people, quite senior people in the movement, come out and come back and look for some sort of amnesty or political engagement with the authorities in Mogadishu. So there's that sort of peeling the onion version. That's the political version. Economically, I mean, if we go back to 2006, when the city Mogadishu was run by basically warlords, and it was largely the warlords' foot soldiers being bought out by the coalition that came under the umbrella of the Islamic Courts Union. That's how we sort of transitioned them out of the city at that point. Maybe there's another type of, that type of model to think about, because I don't get the sense that the majority of al-Shabaab's rank and file foot soldiers are there for sort of ideological reasons. They're not true believers, completely committed, but they are people who are facing serious security dilemmas, economic challenges, and they're supporting al-Shabaab because there's not really better alternatives in some cases. So that's why I think AMISOM has not been able to defeat, nor will it be able to defeat al-Shabaab.
Just beyond Somalia proper, the Seth Jones piece that I was referencing earlier, of the 650 cases, only 7% of them were resolved with military action. So the political path, as we've talked about, or some combination of law enforcement, intelligence degrading their ability to regenerate is the more successful pathway historically, and we'll see in terms of Somalia.
Yes. Hi, my name is Yassine. So I have a few questions for both of you guys. First of all, as a Somali, we feel like AMISOM lack credibility. And the reason why Shabaab is so successful in those areas is they're using existing cleavages that exist in the area. You have Kenya in the south that has troops in Somalia, and you have Ethiopia, and they both have their own agendas. So what a better way to have the local population go against AMISOM? Second of all, if you live in Mogadishu, you see that if you live in Mogadishu and you're an average citizen, you see what AMISOM has done. They've killed a lot of people without impunity in Mogadishu and all of the places that they've been. And also, there's a lot of talks that AMISOM is nothing but, like Paul said, they're nothing but security guards for the VIPs. So, from my perspective, we also know that there's a lot of actors in Somalia right now. That even within the Somali government, we know that the Gulf are involved, the Gulf nations, Qatar, Turkey, and the US and Europe, they all have their own agendas. How can we bring all those different converging ideas together in one way of helping Somalia, instead of just continuing the status quo, which is not helping anyone at the moment, and also is draining the funds of the international donors at this point. So that'll be all.
You sound like you're in favor of option 4, which is, kind of have the AMISOM mission conclude and, kind of the neighbors return to their countries and protect their interests in the ways that they see fit, and that the various, kind of Somali interests are left to sort things out themselves.
Mainly, yes. So if we don't engage them, the problem will always be there. Instead of just creating this boogeyman that exists just like Afghanistan or Iraq, al-Shabaab has been part of the Mogadishu scene for a while now. And I think we could confidently say that, a lot of them operate in daylight. And we saw what happened a year ago on October 14th of last year, the big bombing that happened in Mogadishu. So if they could infiltrate the city, at the time there was a lot of security that was in place at the time, and they infiltrated the city. Not only did they infiltrate the city, they came in the middle of the city. They came all the way to the green zone. So the question is, AMISOM, and Paul said it, AMISOM cannot differentiate between the average Somali and al-Shabaab. So how can a force that cannot tell between who's the enemy, who's not the enemy, be responsible for bringing any sort of peace or any sort of security in a country like that?
This is the basic problem, though, is that too much, or we've got to be careful of putting too many expectations upon a peace operation, right? The fundamental problem, as I see it in Somalia, is one of governance, right? The reason why we have all this conflict and fighting and corruption is that Somalis themselves do not agree how to govern their country. They don't even agree if there's one country or two countries or, et cetera, et cetera. So the fundamental problem is governance. That has boiled down over, I would say, the period since about 2012 onwards to a more practical question of what does it mean to create a federal state in Somalia. So the practical version of that debate about governance is what should be the respective responsibilities of a federal government based in Mogadishu versus the different regional administrations. Now, that's not a job and not a debate that AMISOM should dive into and lead. It's not a job that international and foreign personnel should lead either. It's a job for Somalia's own leaders to come up with those answers. As Amanda said, what does the final constitution look like? How do you interpret that in general? And then when it comes to the national security architecture in particular, who actually pays what resources in terms of running the army and the relationship between the regional administrations and the government? Now, in that sort of mix there, that's created a number of sort of morbid symptoms, of which one is al-Shabaab, that has played on the rifts and the factions and the squabbling between those Somali elites and whispered in the ears of generally the underdogs in each position, that they would make life better if only they listened to us. And it's in that mix that AMISOM, as I said earlier in response to Leslie's question, AMISOM might make some progress on a military track, but AMISOM can't make any progress, or is not in control of making any progress on the political track. The best a peace operation can do is create some political space for the locals to resolve those challenges and those key questions. And as I ended there, the article was written by the former National Security Advisor in Somalia, that there's a much, I think, greater willingness, as you said, to talk to al-Shabaab. These are Somalis. Ultimately, there's probably going to be a political way of ending this war. And so that's the difficulty that AMISOM faces. Too many people, I think, expect a peace operation to solve what are fundamentally governance-related challenges, and it can't.
We have a little less than 10 minutes or a little less than 15 minutes left, so why don't we take a bunch of questions together? So I know EJ, Tyler, and then the woman in the back, and then the panel can grab them, and then we can do a second round if we have time. EJ's right there.
Sorry. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, EJ Hoagland with the International Crisis Group. I guess it's a question for the entire panel, which is, you've all focused on political settlements, but who or what are the major impediments to a political settlement? Is this obstruction by political elites in Mogadishu who fear losing power and resources, or is it the troop contributing countries and their leaders and being unwilling to cede authority to people who've been killing their troops for such a long period of time, or is it Western donors who also have had expressed reservations about negotiating with terrorists in the past? And what kind of a challenge does that present for policymakers here in Washington and elsewhere?
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Tyler Beckelman. I actually just returned back was a colleague of Judd's on the National Security Council in 12 and 13, and just returned back after 4 years as heading up the USAID Somalia field office based out in Nairobi. So thank you both for doing this. This is fantastic. My question is maybe in part way sort of answer to EJ's question a little bit, which is one of the key areas of political agreement is on the nature of a federated SNA. The operational readiness assessment, the national security architecture are good steps, but maybe if you could speak to a little bit more to what a reform of the Somalia security sector would really look like, including the capabilities of local hold forces, which in my experience has been the single greatest factor determining whether or not an area stays stable after an AMISOM intervention. And talk about the impediments to that and what would be needed to get over the hump, since that really will be critical to a conditions-based withdrawal of AMISOM. Second, just a sort of reflection, would encourage everyone to think about the linkage between the incentives that exist on the military and security side and the incentives that exist on the economic side, since the economic reforms that the Somali government has been making have been, one of the bright spots in terms of their reform history. But I'm still at a bit of a loss to think how the international community could relieve Somalia's debt and resume concessional lending when over 50% of their own expenditure goes into basically an unaccountable and ineffective black hole in the security sector.
I'm Pauline, based in Nairobi, and I had some few issues which were bothering me, and one has been actually almost answered, because who is al-Shabaab? That is the question we keep asking. You go there in Somalia and you say you want to drive away al-Shabaab. Who is al-Shabaab? Then the other thing is that about the AMISOM, the way they entered Somalia, you look at Ethiopia. Yes, it was to secure the border, but looking at the port, that time there was the Eritrea-Ethiopia war. So actually Ethiopia wanted access to the port. So it had to go. Now that there is that truce, what happens? That's the other question. Then the other thing is that about Uganda, why were they there? Within the region, it was about hegemony creation within the IGAD countries. And that is why Uganda rushed so much to put soldiers there. So I'm asking myself, what would AMISOM be without Museveni in power? Then the other question I would also ask. But,
I think probably.
yeah,
I think
one more. The other one is about also Kenya. If there was Raila Odinga in power, who is so much against the forces there, what would be the future of that AMISOM, whether they'll be there for a decade or not?
Thank you, and you're going to have to accept that probably we can't answer all of those questions, reshaping the directions of Uganda, Kenya, and a number of other countries, but thank you. Paul, you want to take a first hit?
Sure, and quickly, but happy to chat longer afterwards. So on EJs, what's the major impediment? I mean, I think the major impediment is the Somali elites themselves. There are impediments, you're right, that some of the partners would not want to hold their nose and engage, but the reality is Somalis are engaging in political dialogue with Shabaab, at least at the edges, as I said, or different layers of the onion, and they have been doing that for quite a while now. My sense is it's getting actually to more the pragmatic stage now, where they're starting to think more seriously about where should this take place, how should this take place, if al-Shabaab responds positively, what should the next step be, if it's negative, what should the next. So I think there's a pragmatic push to this, but the key impediment is that I think the regions and the federal government have to truly reconcile, and I don't see evidence of that, and that's not something that outsiders can do. To Tyler's question on the reform of the SNA and security forces more generally, what would it look like? A couple of part answer to that question. One is that I think in terms of time, the dilemma we face is that the short-term threats that the Somali security sector faces are not necessarily going to be the same ones that it faces longer term. And so we've got sort of a military-heavy focus at the moment because we're thinking about al-Shabaab primarily. But longer term, if I think what's the threats that Somali's security sector is going to face, you're going to need police, intelligence, law enforcement services, coast guards, etc. And that's a genuine dilemma that I don't know a way out of. But because we've got a war on now, and you've got to do all this while fighting the war, the SNA has got the bulk of the attention, but it's actually the least important element, I think, if you look at the 10-year, 15-year outset. And then the second way to answer that is, I think the distinction I think about at least is between military professionalism and military effectiveness. And what I mean by that is, we have tried those different dozen or so actors that have engaged in trying to build up the SNA. What has been spoken about in the documents and the aspiration is a military professional force where we follow a professional code of ethics, and the usual version of professionalism. I don't think there is any prospect of a national professional army appearing in like 15, 20 years. And the key reason for that is because I don't think political allegiance of the soldiers lies with the state. the political allegiance of the soldiers lies with either clan, sub-clan, sub-sub-clan, or charismatic individuals, or they are willing to be flexible and go where the money is, and they're willing to be basically bought by whoever the potential. So I think military professionalism is sort of pie in the sky, unless the political elites do what we just talked about. Which means then the second dimension of thinking is, can you find actors in Somalia that are effective enough militarily to keep al-Shabaab out of territory X or territory Y? And I think if you ask that question, you can say yes, right? There are, whether it's Jubaland Security Forces, ASWJ, a couple of brigades, but no more of the SNA, throw Danab in the mix as well, yeah? There, I think you can find a more positive response that in the next couple of years, if you got your act together and really coordinated and supplied with the logistics, helicopter support, ISR support, etc., then you could take out the al-Shabaab units, at least when they mass, I think, and where we find them. And that leads into the sort of first question from the lady at the back about who is al-Shabaab, because I'm not the right person to answer that, really. I'm not an al-Shabaab expert. But I think there's at least three faces of al-Shabaab. One is that you know who they are when they're attacking you with their red bandanas on and their, VBIEDs. And so there's a debate to be had about how do we, in an operational sense, get at those couple of al-Shabaab battalions that we know basically disperse, form up, and when they're trying to do these major attacks, and sort of figure that out. But then the second face and third face of al-Shabaab is what I said earlier, right? It's a very murky line as to who's in and who out, because when I look at al-Shabaab, there's a very small number of sort of true believers. But there's a lot of people in al-Shabaab because either it's economically useful or politically useful, or there's no better alternative. And back to the point that was raised at the back, as credibility about AMISOM's persistence and durability has dropped, and as AMISOM has pulled out of some of the towns that it's recovered and left, sadly, right, locals to face the retribution of al-Shabaab afterwards, more and more people, I think, are just taking pragmatic decisions. If I live in a small settlement somewhere out in south-central Somalia but away from the major population hubs, how do I think about self-security, right? And it makes probably more sense to join up with al-Shabaab nominally. I've interviewed some people who've said as well that they use their family to hedge their bets, right? Buck passing, maybe one son goes with the SNA, one son goes to Shabaab, and you try and cover your bases as best you can. And then on Ethiopia and Kenya, yeah, it's no accident, I think, that if you look at the shape of the regional administrations in Somalia, they all have sea access. And hence, as I said earlier, one of the Somali gripes that at least I've got in my research is that Ethiopia has always been very careful to have at least one regional administration where the Ethiopians have got the people in charge that are going to basically allow them to do that. And then on the Kenyan side, I mean, the politicians who talk a very anti-AMISOM game are not in office, and I suspect when they're in office, you'll see the rhetoric sort of shift, because I think it's not just Somalia with an al-Shabaab problem. Kenya's got an al-Shabaab problem as well, and that's not going to go away just because AMISOM draws down or what have you. So all of Kenya's politicians have got to figure out why Kenyans have basically been pushed away and marginalized and are willing to join either, al-Hijra or Shabaab or whatever. And so that's just a political football I think we're seeing. Uganda, finally, quickly, I mean, Uganda actually prepared and trained its battalions to deploy into the IGASOM mission, the IGAD mission for Somalia in 2005. And remember, at the beginning of AMISOM, the deal was that no frontline state would deploy into Somalia, because precisely the reasons we didn't think it was a good idea to have Kenyans, Ethiopians, Djiboutians in AMISOM. So in IGAD's terms, that only left Uganda and Sudan. And Sudan wasn't interested. Uganda was, for the reasons I've mentioned before. So that's the genesis story, if you like, of Uganda and AMISOM.
Paul, you've nailed most of it. The only extra pieces I might add is thinking about the security services going forward and the discrepancy, regional forces relative to centralized forces. One of the reasons the United States has focused on, quite narrowly, on a small Danab unit is coming up with something that is more professional and is supported and supportable, and could be a model in terms of small forces that are professionalized and that are multi-ethnic in nature that could be deployed into each of the regions, with the rest of the regional forces not having that deliberate multi-ethnic composition or the same types of ability to project power. So really ending up with a quite small set of centralized forces and really focusing on regional forces to maintain security in their regions. They're not intended to be a national army. They're not deployable outside of their regions, and really having more of a gendarmerie kind of concept in place rather than military forces.
Thanks. Well, I just want to maybe contradict or disagree with Paul on one thing. Since I sweated a lot over the 2012 London conference, I think it was a very important event. But I think more importantly, I do think...
So good we had another one.
Yeah. So I do think, EJ, to your point, though, if we're going to talk about sort of going forward on Somalia, I do think we have to have a reaffirmation of how the principles of the transition, political and security. And some of them are in Paul's great book, which is that AMISOM has military culminated. I think that it is much more of a law enforcement, intelligence, policing operation. Much of that should be done at the state level, whereas Tyler mentioned, Amanda mentioned, I think there's much more of a connection, investment, capability to do these issues. I think that we have to talk about the Gulf states, and that's a good setting to do it. They were all at the London conference, but it is ripping apart federalism. It's not the way that it was intended, and I think that there needs to be a higher level conversation about how the Gulf Rift is undermining FMS and the central government's relationships. And there's a number of other ones too, but I think that we need to kind of reassess where we are. I do think this is a really appropriate point, a crossroads, and let's look at all of the key issues that we've been, and the bromides that we've been focused on over the last couple of years to make sure that they still validate, and then figure out how we go forward. I hope everyone will join me in thanking Paul and Amanda for coming today. I hope you're all gonna buy Paul's book. You can get a discounted rate on the flyer.
Oh yes, indeed.
It's incredibly discounted.
Still expensive though.
Still expensive, but it's worth it. Thanks everyone, have a good afternoon.